Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is The Blond Knight of Germany, Chapter 9. Stalin Hawks. Seek out your enemy. Do not ask how strong the enemy is, but where he is to be found. Motto of the Soviet fighter pilots. Relatively early in his combat career, Erich Hartmann exceeded the 1939 to 1945 totals of the top-scoring British and American fighter aces. Sketches already presented of Hartmann's fellow aces in JG52 reveal that many German aces on the Eastern Front exceeded 100 victories. Since the German methods of recording and verifying victories were accurate and reliable, the conclusion seems inescapable that Hartmann and other high-scoring Eastern Front aces faced inferior opposition, both in planes and pilots. This conclusion can be justified only in a limited way, because many aspects of the Eastern Front air war bearing on fighter operations are but little known in the West outside Germany. If Russian inferiority in planes and pilots is accepted as a universal explanation for the success of the German aces in Russia, then the notable achievements of Soviet industry and Russian fighter aces will be obscured. Dislike for an ideology or a regime must be set aside in assessing the historical facts of Soviet air power. Germans, Americans, and British alike have long shared a fatuous conceit concerning Russian achievements, and the disasters that have befallen the German people since 1941 may be deemed to have originated in their leaders' underestimation of the Soviet colossus. For the Americans, the space race should have deflated by now the sense of universal superiority held by America in its attitudes towards things Russian. The Soviet Union's combination of a low standard of living with brilliant technical achievements confounds the conventional Western mind and leads to massive errors of judgment. In evaluating the Eastern Front air war and Erich Hartmann's achievements, an error is committed if we uncritically convince ourselves that he was shooting down ducks over the steppes. The enemy could and did shoot back, with first-line aircraft often superior in performance to the Me-109. Some of these machines were flown by the top-scoring Allied aces of the war, Russian pilots who handily outscored the British and the Americans. A fair and unbiased view of Erich Hartmann's victory tally must therefore focus primarily on the quality of the Russian opposition, both technical and human. Published engineering data precludes the theory of inferior Russian aircraft as a blanket explanation of high German scores. From the beginning of the Russo-German conflict, the Russians had at least one fighter that was superior to the Me-109 in most respects. As the war progressed, the Soviet aircraft industry not only produced other types of fighters superior to the many variants of the Me-109, but also accomplished prodigies of aircraft production, far outstripping the Germans in this sphere. The authors in their previous book, Kozhedub, Fighter Aces of the Luftwaffe, dealt extensively with the character of the Eastern Front air war and the differences between this vast conflict and the air struggle in the West. There is a natural tendency in Western countries to regard the Anglo-American air assault on Germany as a major arena of aerial conflict. In truth, the aircraft losses sustained by the Soviet Union were approximately twice those suffered by the Anglo-American air forces. The biggest air war was fought on the Eastern Front. Reorganized in 1939 to gradually become a separate service from the Red Army, the Soviet Air Force had previously been hampered in its development through tight army control. The Air Division under the reorganization became the largest unit, each air division consisting of from 3 to 6 air regiments made up of 4 or 5 squadrons per regiment. German estimates of Soviet air strength at the time of the invasion of Russia in June 1941 concluded that the Red Air Force had between 40 and 50 air divisions containing approximately 162 regiments. Overall, numerical strength was estimated at about 10,500 airplanes. Red fighter forces were equipped primarily with the I-16 Rata or its later variants, the I-151 and I-153. The Rata was a single-seat gull-wing biplane introduced to air combat in the Spanish Civil War. Obsolete in 1941, the Rata was being replaced by the MiG-3 and Lag-3 fighters when the Germans struck. Less than a quarter of the Russian conversion to modern monoplanes had been achieved when the Luftwaffe arrived to make bonfires out of the Soviet air fleets parked on bases along the front. The virtual eradication of Soviet air power as a factor in the defense of Russia in the first 90 days was one of the Luftwaffe's most complete triumphs. Tactical ground support remained the primary mission of the Soviet Air Force even after the 1939 reorganization. As a consequence, nearly every aircraft available, including fighters, was fitted to carry bombs. In early encounters, the German air superiority fighters that accompanied Luftwaffe bomber and fighter bomber strikes took terrible toll of bomb-carrying Soviet fighters intercepting the invaders. Subsequent Soviet Air Force orders forbade Russian pilots of fighters carrying bombs to engage German air superiority fighters, so that combat was often refused by the Russians. The Germans attributed this to a lack of aggressiveness until interrogation of downed Russian pilots revealed the truth. The Soviet Union was in many respects better prepared for the challenges of the air war than were Britain in 1939 and America in 1941. Special attention and planning was devoted in Russia to building up a reserve of trained pilots. Similarly, preparations for large-scale aircraft production on a 24-hour-a-day basis were so far advanced by 1941 that the Russians were able to recover rapidly from the air blitzkrieg of June and July 1941. The Russians maintained a steady flow of pilots from their training schools to man the flood of fighters that poured from Soviet factories. Russian losses were severe throughout the war, but their fighter pilots improved steadily as the war progressed, in contrast to the degeneration of pilot training that plagued the Luftwaffe fighter force. Germany's lack of a four-engine strategic bomber allowed the USSR to operate vast armament factories and flying schools beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. As a consequence, all this material and personnel had to be dealt with after it reached the front. From late 1942 onward, Russian air power became an irresistible aerial tide that grew in strength with the passage of every month. By mid-1944, the Russians dominated the air over the Eastern Front and were far superior tactically to their 1941 status. Despite these facts, the legend that all Russian front air combat was some kind of easy picnic for the Germans has enjoyed such long concurrency that it has become almost a historical doctrine. The facts rule out any blanket conclusion that flying against the Red Air Force was easy. Erich Hartmann likens Eastern Front combat to the fighter assaults on the Allied bomber streams in the West. The hails of lead and steel that filled the air made it inevitable that a pilot constantly in action would fly into some stray projectiles sometime. Often there were 10 of us against 300 Russians. Those are long odds. A mid-air collision was almost as likely as being shot down too. We had to plan our attacks against these hordes with great care, or we never would have survived. As to Russian pilot quality, the experience of German aces on the Eastern Front varies widely. In day-to-day operations over long periods, the Germans felt superior both technically and psychologically. This was especially true of the top German pilots. Nevertheless, there is virtual unanimity concerning the quality of the Guards fighter regiments, the elite of the Soviet fighter arm. The Russians earned the Germans' respect. Crack Soviet pilots were concentrated in the Guards regiments. They were the real fighter types, aggressive, tactically formidable, fearless, and flying some of the finest fighter aircraft in existence. Their operations were vitalized by the same kind of unquenchable morale that characterized the immortal few of the Battle of Britain. The aggressive spirit of these Soviet pilots is illustrated in a remarkable incident near Orel involving a young Stalin hawk named Lieutenant Vladimir D. Lavrinenkov. An ace with 30 kills, Lavrinenkov downed an Mi-109 in battle and watched the German pilot land in a flat field. The Luftwaffe pilot scrambled from the cockpit and dashed for cover in a nearby gully filled with trees and underbrush. Circling low over the scene, Lavrinenkov saw that Red Army units would probably not locate the German and that he might therefore escape. The young Russian lieutenant landed his fighter next to the crashed Me-109 and led the searching infantry to the thickets in the gully. Lavrinenkov found the downed German and, pouncing on him, strangled him to death with his hands. The Russian ace returned immediately to his fighter and took off in a cloud of dust, leaving his dead foe at the feet of the open-mouthed Russian infantrymen. The Guards regiments produced the top-scoring Allied fighter pilots of the Second World War. The desire to denigrate everything Russian on account of ideological enmities ill serves the recording of history. There is a widespread and irrational prejudice against considering the Eastern Front air war as comparable to the Western Front air struggle, but the facts are that no fighter pilots in history ever faced the odds that were the daily way of life of the Germans on the Eastern Front. Similarly, the Soviet Union's outstanding fighter aces have not been accorded a fair hearing by chroniclers of the conflict. The top Russian pilots, whose scores were half as large again as the best American and British scores, have remained in obscurity for a quarter of a century. All the leading German aces on the Eastern Front were either shot down or forced down many times. The exposure rate of these pilots was the highest in history. Using Erich Hartmann as an example, his 1,400 sorties and 800 aerial battles, most of them fought against high numerical odds, made it inevitable that he would be at a tactical disadvantage in a proportion of his encounters. He estimates that approximately 200 times he found himself under the guns of Soviet fighters. While Hartmann, Rall, Barkhorn and the other top German aces were probably the most skilled air fighters of all time, the numerical odds against them, the law of averages and sheer chance, resulted in their being downed one way or another. Wherever the Guards regiments were operating, the Luftwaffe could be sure of solid opposition. The masses of Russian pilots stood below the Guards in skill, but still took their toll of the Germans in the long battle of attrition. The top Soviet ace of the war, Major General Ivan Kozhedub, scored 62 aerial victories against the Luftwaffe, and 7 other Soviet pilots are credited with more victories than the top-scoring Anglo-American ace, Major Richard I. Bong, with his 40 victories scored in the Pacific Theater of Operations. Ivan Kozhedub was born in 1920 in Ukraine, the son of a factory worker. He got into flying through one of the many aviation clubs that flourished in the USSR during the 1930s. His career with the Guards regiments of the Red Air Force led him to 3 awards of Hero of the Soviet Union, a decoration approximately corresponding to the US Congressional Medal of Honor. Kozhedub is reported to have commanded the North Korean Air Division of fighters in 1951 to 1952 during the Korean War. His units were equipped with MiG-15 jets, which were lighter aircraft than the USAF F-86E and F-86F Sabres with which they did battle. Whether Kozhedub flew any combat sorties in Korea is an unanswered question nearly 20 years later, but it is possible that he did so since he was at that time a young man of 31. United States military authorities feel certain that skilled Russian pilots did fly combat in Korea and believe it is possible that Kozhedub added to his 62 kills of the Second World War. Kozhedub's autobiography, I Attack, was published in the Eastern Zone of Germany in 1956. What should and could have been a historical work of interest is instead a turgid, highly polemical account of his life, the supreme experience of which is his admission to the Communist Party. Every aspect of his career, from early school days through to his winning his country's highest decoration, is seen through a red prism, which distorts even as it colors a brilliant flying career. The most famous Soviet fighter ace, and one whose units frequently opposed JG-52, is Colonel Alexander Pukrishkin of the Guards Regiment. Sasha Pukrishkin is credited with 59 confirmed aerial victories, and during the war he also won his Gold Star as Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times. Pukrishkin's career has many common elements with those of numerous German and Allied aces. The international fraternity of old aces could recount many similar stories. Regardless of the uniform worn or the flag served under, most fighter aces have been through the same fires in much the same way. Pokryshkin was inspired during his Siberian boyhood by the achievements of Russian pioneer aviator Valery Chkalov. He left his home at Novosibirsk to seek his fortune via aviation school, but his enthusiasm turned to dismay when he found that the aviation school was strictly for mechanics and not for flying training. He began filing semi-annual requests for transfer to pilot training, but his mechanical aptitudes were so outstanding that his superiors consistently denied his requests to become a flyer. Pokryshkin, however, would not be put off or put down. He joined the Krasnodar Aviation Club, which operated under the Soviet Ossoaviachim scheme, and like Erich Hartmann in Germany, he learned glider flying. Pokryshkin also learned parachute jumping and then graduated to powered flight. At the age of 24, he took his first hop in October 1937 in a lumbering U-2. Still serving as an aircraft mechanic, Pokryshkin soon soloed successfully and passed his pilot's examination. He persisted in filing requests for transfer to piloting, and eventually he wore down his superiors by sheer persistence. His transfer was finally approved. Pokryshkin joined a fighter training unit at Kachar and was shortly afterward assigned to a regular fighter unit of the Red Air Force. Whatever sense of egalitarianism the Russian Revolution might have induced in Pokryshkin was given a rude jolt when he joined the fighter squadron. He was still wearing mechanics insignia on his uniform, and his fellow pilots would barely talk to him. He was stigmatized in their eyes because he was an ex-mechanic, while they considered themselves legitimate pilots. The undaunted Pokryshkin soon proved himself to be more than just an upstart mechanic. His fine piloting skill was undeniable, and his detailed knowledge of aircraft construction and engines far exceeded that of his fellow pilots. They soon accepted him completely, but the range of his knowledge would normally have diverted him into service as an instructor. Pokryshkin was able to avoid this sidetrack largely through his dynamic and avid interest in aerial tactics. He did historians a favor during this period by keeping a diary and setting down his tactical concepts as they developed. His Bible was My Air Combats, a classic book on First World War fighter tactics written by Captain René Paul Fonck of France. Fonck was the top Allied fighter ace of the war, with 75 confirmed aerial victories. Serious, determined, and studious, Pokryshkin practiced Fonck's theories and maneuvers in mock aerial combat, modifying and extending them to fit the new generations of fighter planes. He introduced innovations. His mechanics training in mathematics had endowed him with a drive for precision, and he sketched in his diary all his tactical maneuvers and those of his opponents. He maintained this routine throughout his combat career. The trends of post-revolutionary culture in Russia had been toward the production of a mass psychology in which individualism was looked on as something inherently bad and bourgeois. This outlook became structural in the generation of young men who were to fight the Second World War for Russia. The result was that the qualities essential to success in airfighting, high individuality, quick decision, hair-trigger initiative, were blunted in millions of young Russians. Dogmatic steel nerve was the usual substitute. The experience of the Germans who fought them verifies that the Russians for the most part had to overcome a psychological barrier as pilots far more challenging than the techniques of modern aircraft design. They conquered the latter and battled with the former. Born in 1913, Pokryshkin was through his formative childhood years before the compulsive elements of Soviet education had time to work on him in depth. He became a great ace because he comprehended from the outset the importance of the individual in aerial combat. Through his endless sketches and persistent studies of maneuver, he could see how an exceptional pilot in an inferior aircraft might well defeat a less competent opponent in a superior machine. This conviction was reinforced by all the experience he acquired in mock combat. Like Erich Hartmann on the German side, Pokryshkin became a devotee of the sudden, swift, and violent attack. His early guide in developing this mode of attack was a veteran fighter pilot named Sokolov, who flew with him in the first squadron he joined. Sokolov insisted that the sudden savage strike won the psychological battle immediately, leaving the enemy pilot rattled and ready to be shot out of the sky. Pokryshkin wrote in his diary, "The factors of victory are maneuver and fire." Pokryshkin had devoted himself primarily to aerobatics and maneuvering. When he turned his attention to the actual business of bringing the other man down by gunfire, he found he had much still to learn. Sasha, as he was called, couldn't shoot to save himself. When he practiced with a drogue target, he made one firing pass after another until his ammunition was exhausted. Hundreds of rounds flew off into the blue, while the drogue suffered 3 or 4 hits. A puzzled Pokryshkin could not understand his inability to hit the target in the air. His approaches were perfect, and he followed the gunnery instructions in the Air Force manuals to the letter. He resorted to his mathematical background for the answer. He sat down and figured out trajectories, bullet velocities, and the problems of air-to-air shooting from a mathematical standpoint. He covered pages with involved calculations and drew many graphs. These labors brought him to the same conclusion reached by Erich Hartmann in actual combat many years later. As such, wrote the elated Pokryshkin, success depends on firing from close range. Convinced that the problem was to compute the proper initial position for point-blank attack, Pokryshkin drew more maneuvering diagrams for this purpose and took off the next day in a fever of anticipation. He wrote of his experiment. The secret was as follows. I approached the cone from a definite angle and attacked, pressing on the firing buttons at a time when, according to all the rules, I should already be swerving aside. For a young pilot that was taking a big risk, the slightest inaccuracy and I should be pumping lead into the towing plane instead of the cone. When we landed, the pilot who towed the drogue was furious. "What in the hell made you crowd in on me like that? You could kill a fellow that way." But neither my hand nor eye deceived me. I continued firing from short range and with deadly accuracy. That is what infighting in air combat means. Pokryshkin, through mathematical analysis, had found the same basic tactical formula that Erich Hartmann's native analytical ability would find him many years later. The similarity of their concepts and findings seems remarkable. Both found the validity of their conclusions verified in actual combat. In over 600 sorties and 59 victories, Pokryshkin found no reason to question the accuracy of his pre-war findings. At the time of the German invasion of Russia in 1941, Pokryshkin was a fully fledged fighter pilot serving in Ukraine. 2 days after the first German assault, he flew a recce mission to Jassy, an area in which the fighters of JG-52 later encountered Pokryshkin's fighters many times during the period of Hartmann's service. With Lieutenant Semyonov as his wingman, Pokryshkin in a MiG-3 sighted 5 Mi-109s, 3 at lower altitude and 2 above his Russian element. Pokryshkin hauled back on the stick and began a swift climb toward the higher German element. The pilot of the leading German fighter zoomed and Pokryshkin countered with a small turn that brought him around on the German's tail. Closing in to point-blank range, Sasha sent a burst into the Mi-109 from all guns. The German fighter burst the fire and went roaring earthward, trailing smoke. Exulting over his first kill, the young Russian made the same error that cost many young fighter pilots their lives. He watched his victim plunging downward, fascinated by the fiery spectacle. The stricken German's wingman bounced Pokryshkin while he watched the show. Sasha snapped back to business as his port wing was riven by a series of cannon shells and tracer went lancing past his canopy. Pokryshkin put his MiG-3 into a dive to deck level and half crouching in his cockpit behind his armor plate, like Erich Hartmann on his first combat mission, he went hedge-hopping home. His first triumph had been tempered by the narrowness of his escape. Fighter aces of the eminence of Adolf Galland and Günter Rall confessed to being similarly clobbered when they could not resist watching a spectacular crash. Galland almost lost his life and was wounded. Rall ended up in a crash that broke his back and put him at death's door. Pokryshkin thus learned this fundamental lesson in the same way as 2 of Germany's finest pilots. The bold Pokryshkin, with his mode of attack now clearly proved in hot water, nevertheless got little opportunity for more fighter-to-fighter combat until the autumn of 1941. He flew innumerable reconnaissance missions, but seldom tangled with German fighters. He never ceased studying the art of aerial maneuver, and in later battles he found that his response to enemy attacks was prompt and appropriate. He had made moves and counter-moves so much a part of his existence that he was instinctively doing the right thing in combat, and staying alive as a result. Pokryshkin's innovations were largely responsible for breaking the Soviet Air Force out of the straitjacket of horizontal maneuver in which all pre-war Soviet fighter doctrine had been confined. Taught to fly and fight in horizontal planes before the war, the Russians were rapidly re-educated to the new realities by 1941 to 1942 aerial combat. Improved aircraft performance and the new low-wing monoplane era opened vertical maneuver to fighter tactics, and Pokryshkin was among the most significant contributors to Russian tactical development. He used the climbing spiral often for evasion. Against the advice of his more conservative comrades, he practiced the snap roll as a speed-killing maneuver to make pursuing Germans overshoot and thus become his victims. His leadership, knowledge of aircraft design and engineering, and his abilities as a tutor brought him to the front rank of Russian fighter pilot personalities. What Pokryshkin taught others he had himself wrought in the fires of war. His photographic memory permitted him to recall details of every maneuver in combat. He set all these details down in sketch form and hung his dugout walls with diagrams, graphs, and performance charts. Like the top German pilots he faced, Pokryshkin was shot down many times. He made numerous forced landings, and his comrades were often aghast at the shattered condition of his fighter when he staggered back from battles with the Luftwaffe. Pokryshkin's passion for knowing his enemy was insatiable. He not only kept detailed records of maneuvers, but also flew captured German fighters, carefully noting what he believed to be their weaknesses. He put himself in the place of a German pilot in these maneuvers and wrote at length on the qualities and deficiencies of the Me-109. He considered the best Soviet fighter plane superior to the rugged German bird. Over the Kuban Peninsula, when his regiment again mixed for a protracted period with JG-52, Pokryshkin developed his basic formula for aerial combat, distilling his knowledge and experience into 4 words: altitude, speed, maneuver, fire. With good aircraft and leaders like Pokryshkin, the Guards fighter regiments were afraid of no one in the air. Many times, JG-52 radio monitors were startled to hear Russian radio transmitters switch on to German frequencies. The Russians would throw down the gauntlet with a challenge in German. "Beware all German pilots, the ace Pokryshkin is in the air." This kind of fighter pilot morale was probably exceptional on the Russian side, but it was the common possession of the Guards regiments. They painted the aircraft in wild colors, favoring brilliant red patterns, and in every way were they counterparts of the best fighter units in other air forces. Pokryshkin resembled Erich Hartmann in yet another way. He believed in the careful guidance of new pilots, to keep them alive as a fundamental accomplishment of leadership and as a prelude to making them aces by experiences and tutoring. He took pains to explain the art of maneuver, using his profound knowledge backed up by his beloved diagrams. He taught them to bring in their shooting eye, and a number of the top-scoring Russian aces owed their success to his tutoring. Alexander Klubov, who is credited with 50 victories over the Luftwaffe, was broken in and trained for leadership by Pokryshkin. Klubov was twice awarded the Gold Star as Hero of the Soviet Union. As Russia's best-known ace, Pokryshkin thus fought like, and to a great degree tactically thought like, Erich Hartmann. Pokryshkin nevertheless can be equated more with Colonel Werner Mölders than with any other Luftwaffe pilot and fighter leader. The Russian was about the same age as Mölders, and his tactical insight and perseverance in developing new methods are strongly reminiscent of Mölders, who was largely responsible for freeing the Luftwaffe of old-fashioned tactics inherited from the First World War. Daddy Mölders had the same kind of precise mentality as Pokryshkin, and the German leaders' careful direction of young pilots has, by their own present-day admission, allowed them to enjoy a prosperous middle age in contemporary Germany. Propagandist distortions of the Russians should not be permitted to obscure Pokryshkin's achievements as a fighter ace, leader, and tactician. His fame is well earned, and it is appropriate to recognize him in this book since he fought so frequently against Erich Hartmann's units in JG52. There is no firm evidence that Pushkin and Erich Hartmann ever fought each other aloft, and nor can it be said with certainty that they were never direct aerial antagonists. In more than 800 aerial battles, many of them against formations commanded by Pushkin, it is possible that the Blond Knight did encounter the famous Russian, but no one can say for sure. Both aces were shot down or forced down many times. For historical purposes, the authors include a list of Soviet fighter aces with 30 or more aerial victories. The list originated with the Soviet air historian M. Moskov and reached the authors via Miss Jean Alexander of London, British air historian, and the Cassidy group of researchers with whom she is associated. As of November 1967, it is believed to be the most accurate list of Soviet aces available.
Another interesting episode, this one. It should also dispel the myth that the authors somehow hated the Russians or wanted to portray them in a bad light. Generally, that is. Quite obviously, this isn't the case, as they speak very highly of them here. And you have to give the Russians some credit indeed, as they were able to modernize their somewhat lackluster air force in record time and also produce many good pilots as well. However, there are two claims that I had to look into because they seemed a bit peculiar. First, the episode speaks of an incident involving two-time hero of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lavrinenkov. It is claimed that he, after shooting down a German plane, chased down the pilot and, being frustrated that Soviet ground troops would miss him, landed his plane close by, rushed over to bushes where the man was hiding, and then strangled him to death with his bare hands. Now, we all know that the Russians were capable of great violence and cruelty, but I found this random act of violence to be a bit suspect, if I'm honest. So I did the research, and accounts of this incident are sparse. However, Lavrinenkov's Russian Wikipedia page refers to this exact incident. Apparently, when confronted with this story after the war, he laughed and jokingly said, "Well, at least I didn't eat him." Probably sarcastically referring to the absurdity of this tale. I personally tend to classify this story as scuttlebutt, but you make your own judgment. The next remark concerns three-time hero of the Soviet Union, Ivan Kozhedub. While Kozhedub is pretty famous and apparently was the first Soviet pilot to shoot down an Mi-262, we will learn about that in a bit, the authors have mentioned his autobiography, called in Russian Moy Vospomинania, Sluju Rodine, meaning My Memories, I Serve the Fatherland, while the German title is simply Ich greife an, meaning I am attacking. The authors claim that the book is riddled with praise for the party and lacks a bit of insight into the life of the pilot. Well, you know how I roll. I, of course, bought one of the few remaining examples of said book and took a look myself. So here we are, with this conveniently sized book that I was lucky to get a hold of. So welcome to Book Club Diaries. Now, as you can see, I've made quite a few notes during my reading of the book, but before we begin, Toliver and Constable say that, and I quote, "What should and could have been a historical work of interest is instead a turgid, highly polemical account of his life, the supreme experience of which is his admission to the Communist Party. Every aspect of his career, from early school days through to his winning his country's highest decoration, is seen through a red prism, which distorts even as it colors a brilliant flying career." And while this is true, remember that this book was first published in Russian in 1950, so at a time when Stalin was still alive. Like I always say when it comes to historical accounts, remember to see them in the context of the time they were written in. Same goes for this book. That being said, it leads to moments where this book is unintentionally comedic, but we will get to that. Generally speaking, it's 214 pages and the German translation is really good. But you can immediately tell by the way that it was written, by the vast vocabulary in certain phrases, that this book is from the 1950s, which makes it quite a charming time capsule. On the cover, we see what is probably an LA-7, a Lavochkin LA-7, that is approaching the reader and for some reason is firing through the propeller hub. LA-7s couldn't do that, but I let it slide. And as we take a look inside, there is no table of contents. Only a short introduction of Kozhedub, and then the book starts. It immediately starts with a banger, and I see if I get my notes off without destroying the book. Oh God. It introduces the man in the first sentence, says where he was born, and then in the third sentence it says, in Ivan's youth, the kulaks still ruled the village. And the word used here is kind of derogatory in this context. The kulaks still ruled the village, and only with the collectivization came progress in this remote region. So we all know what happened in the 1920s and 30s in Ukraine, and saying that this was progress that reached the village due collectivization, well, I'm sure there are others who don't see it that way, at least not as positive. In any case, let's go on. Page 7. Yes, here we learn about Soviet aviation training in the times, which was generally broken down into 4 phases. The first one was ground school, which was purely theory-based in the classroom. Then they conditioned what he calls his vestibular apparatus. He means the vestibular organ in his inner ear, which is responsible for balance, by, and I shit you not, using the trampoline and doing somersaults on it for a couple of weeks. Then the third phase is parachute training, where they first go to a jump tower to do some practice jumps, and then they actually jump out of airplanes. And during that stage, one of his classmates is complaining about being nervous, and one of their teachers literally tells him to go touch grass, which he does, and he calms down. And then the final phase is flight training, where they would go up first with an instructor and then perform even some slight aerial acrobatics. It was a test at that point, and he says that up until a year earlier, student pilots who became sick during aerobatics were dismissed immediately. Then he goes on to perform his first solo, and then only afterwards would they get their medical tests. Now, you might argue that it is more prudent to conduct the medical tests in the beginning of the training, and you would be right, because there's the potential that after the 2 years that all of this took, you might still fail your medical and have studied 2 years for nothing, which is exactly what happens to 2 of his classmates, and they are actually furious, which is quite understandable. Then there's another phase of ground school where he talks about familiarization with the aircraft, and they of course get paired with an old grumpy mechanic who does the standard role of sending him off to the workshop to get a bucket of compression from it, which is identical to sending a young student to get blinker fluid or clicking plates for the torque wrench. Now, he sees through the ruse immediately, but he still does it out of respect. Here again, they do the first flight with the instructor, and they do some spinning tests and spinning training and stall training, and he goes through it without a problem. Then here on page 28, he talks about the final exam, which he passes with flying colors. He is, in fact, so good that he immediately becomes a flight instructor. He's 21 years old at the time, and he says explicitly that he's angry because he wants to go to the front line, which I think most pilots at the time would have wanted to do. Then he talks about his life as an instructor, and he says in German, and let me see, I discovered clearly the importance of the flight instructor's job for the growth of the potential flyers, for the development of his flying and moral skills, and for his martial and political education. So you see, we are still in the Soviet Union, and this kind of language goes through the entirety of the book, but we get to that. Then war breaks out, they get briefed by the local commissar, and they're all eager to get to the front. Then, during his time as a flight instructor, he repeatedly volunteers for frontline service, but he gets rebuked most of the time because there was a single mishap that happened to one of his students, and the responsibility and blame gets placed upon him, so he gets denied. Then another mishap later, he has to crash land because he runs out of fuel, and he says, the group captain was threatening me with his fist. He was circling around him at the time. Then finally, he gets transferred to a frontline unit and gets familiarized with the Lavochkin LA-5, and his very first flight goes down well, but on his second flight he was ordered to conduct 2 flights at the time to familiarize himself with the airplane. He somehow has a gut feeling that something isn't right, and telling this to his group captain, the group captain says, "Why are you hesitating, Comrade Sergeant? I ordered you to conduct 2 flights. No?" He says, well, the group captain's word is law. He takes off, and of course the engine immediately quits. And he also has to crash land again and makes it out with a head injury. A head injury that he says was debilitating at the time. However, as is par for the course for Soviets, his group captain came to his bed and says, It's time for you to fly at the front. You must not get sick. Gather your strength. Don't let your head hang. You'll see it'll pass soon. You're strong. And he says, the words of the commander had great healing power. I gained courage, and after a few days, I was completely healthy again. Well, you see, his political education and his belief in the final victory was helping him cope with his injuries. Then, during the combat times, he's constantly praising the political officer for his presentations and sharp wit and humor. And then he has his first combat sortie against Me-110s. And as we've learned in other books from other pilots of the time, especially young pilots tend to target fixate on their first targets. And the exact same thing happens to him. And while he's engaging the Me-110s, he's jumped by 4 Me-109s who were circling above. And only at the last second does he managed to get out of this predicament and avoids being shot down, although his plane is extremely heavily damaged, but he makes it back. Only 2 sorties later, his best friend dies after ramming an enemy plane, and he of course is devastated by it, but he talks about this with the people around him, but still manages to put in a bit of Soviet Union propaganda, and he quotes his fallen friend with the words, "After the war, after the fascists have been beaten, I will invite you to my place. My home is your home. And if the enemy is in your home, so he is also in mine. Because we have a common home, the Soviet Union." Well, you see, like I said, this is riddled through almost the entire book, but you have to look at it through the context of the time that it was written in. Again, he also talks about his loss and his grief with the commissar, and the commissar, being the empath that he is, only tells him, "Bolsheviks never lose their courage. They close their ranks even tighter when one of their comrades falls." I mean, if this doesn't lift your spirits, I don't know what will. Then there are the celebrations of May the 1st, 1943, where they receive packages and gifts from the Soviet workers from all over the country, and on the way back to their dorms, they go and tell each other, "What hearty letters the workers from the hinterland have sent us. We must not disappoint them." Then, a few months later, he is offered to join the party. He wasn't a party member from the beginning, but he was offered to join, and the local party leader goes to him and encouraged him to join with the words, "You are all working diligently and fighting true and brave. You have gained military experience and also grew politically. I view you as partyless Bolsheviks. If you feel that you are up to it to bear the high rank of a Bolshevik, then put in your joining paper. Think about it." And he did, of course, because being a party member at the time was a fast track to promotions and other benefits, but I'm not sure he saw it that way. Then he comes to his first aerial victory, where he fights against the Ju-87, and they talk about it afterwards, and here's the classic thing that all fighter pilots across all nations do. In the debrief, he says that they were doing these hand movements that we're all familiar with to reenact the scenes and the fighting. Then he talks about the first time he was awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, which was on February the 4th, 1944. And again, he gets provided with this medal, and the only thing he manages to say, which was customary at the time, was, "I serve the Soviet Union." Then we get to the part, I've skipped a few pages, he talks about aerial fighting, about the situation on the ground. It's really well written, and unfortunately there is no English version of this available, but we'll see. Maybe I get to translating it at some time, because the publishing house, the German military publishing house, which has a nice logo, you see, this is an SKS with a bayonet, and the abbreviation is some kind of a flag. So this should be public domain. We'll see. If I have the time, maybe I get to translate it at some point. Anyway, he talks about his Me-262 encounter, and we learn about in the book, The Blond Knight, and also in the Wikipedia page, that apparently he was the first Soviet to shoot down an Me-262, but let's take a look what he says about it. So for context, his group captain at the time had already encountered one Me-262 and they had mythical status within the unit. And he says he was craving to meet an aircraft of that type in the air to fight it. And it happened on February the 24th, 1945, where he surprised one of the Me-262 that was flying along the Oder River. And his plan was to inspect it from up close because he wasn't detected by the German pilot at the time, and told his wingman to stay back so that he could take a look. However, his wingman got nervous and started opening fire, which led to the German pilot discovering the both of them and making a left turn into Kozhedub's field of fire. And he says the enemy plane banked sharply to one side and was offering itself and its backside up to me. However, my shots lay very good, but there was no victory. So he fired upon it, but there was no aerial victory, and he himself says that he in fact did not shoot it down. Well, you see what propaganda can make of an event like this. So from his own mouth, he didn't shoot it down at the time, although even Wikipedia says that he did. So we are 1945, he gets transferred around for a bit, he gets put into an administrative position which he doesn't enjoy at all, and then the war ends, there are huge celebrations, and he goes back to his village. So they met at the local party headquarters and had a huge party, and he says, the first toast went to the initiator of all our victories, to the Communist Party. A loud and unified hurrah was heard. Then Ponomarenko, the oldest comrade, in a dignified manner said, the collective Red Partisan is welcoming you, Ivan Nikitovich. It is a shame that your father, Nikita Ilarionovich, doesn't get to experience this with us. He would be proud of you. We thank the Communist Party, we thank the Soviet Army for having raised our countrymen in this way. And there you go. This was a short and concise summary of the book. I had a lot of fun reading this, and unfortunately, like I said, there is no English version of this, but yeah, we'll see what the time brings. I can recommend this if you are a German native or if you have a bit of German knowledge. It's written in a way that it is quite useful for learning the language because it is written in a precise and concise language, and you can learn a thing or two about the man and the time in which it was written. So, if you like this, then thank you for watching, thank you for your continued support, and we will learn more about Erich in the next episode. Cheers.